Mississippi, summer of 1851. Thomas Bowmont slammed Eliza against the wall, his hand tight around her throat, his voice low and cold. "You will do what I say, or I will sell your mother before sunrise." She couldn't scream. She couldn't fight. The law said she wasn't even a person. But the man forcing her into his bed called her his second wife, and had no idea his real wife was already on her way home. If you are new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Eliza Carter had learned very early in her life that silence was not weakness. Silence was strategy. Silence was the reason she was still alive at 23 years old on the Bowmont plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, while others around her had been sold, separated, broken, or buried. She knew how to disappear inside a room full of people. She knew how to answer a question without ever truly answering it. She knew how to lower her eyes at exactly the right moment, not too fast, which would look suspicious, and not too slow, which could look like defiance. She had perfected the art of invisibility, and for years that art had kept her breathing. The Bowmont plantation was not the worst place in Mississippi. That was the terrible truth that Eliza carried inside her every single day. She had heard stories from women who passed through, from men who arrived in chains from other counties, about places where the overseer's word was the only law, where children were separated from their mothers before they could even speak, where a person could be worked to death before the summer ended, and no one would write it down. The Bowmont plantation had its cruelties, deep and quiet and consistent, but it also had a mistress. And Margaret Bowmont, for all her coldness, for all the distance she kept from the people her husband owned, had a certain order to her, a code. Not kindness, Eliza never confused the two, but a structure that made survival possible. Thomas Bowmont was a different story entirely. Eliza had watched him for years, the way you watch weather. You learn the patterns. You learn when the sky is getting ready to turn. Thomas was 41 years old, with the posture of a man who had never once been told no by someone he respected. He was handsome in the way that men with power often are, not because of anything God gave him, but because of the way a room rearranged itself around him whenever he walked in. He smiled easily and laughed loudly and made guests feel welcome. And none of that made Eliza trust him. If anything, the ease of his smile was the most dangerous thing about him. A man who is cruel in obvious ways, you can prepare for that. A man who is cruel behind a smile, that is something else entirely. The trouble started in the spring of 1851, when Margaret Bowmont left the estate. Her sister had fallen gravely ill in Savannah, Georgia, and the letter that arrived carried the kind of urgency that made Margaret pack within the hour. She stood in the front hall, giving instructions to the household with the calm efficiency of a woman who had run this place for 16 years and trusted no one, including her husband, to manage it without her presence. She looked at Eliza last. "You will manage the house," Margaret said. Not a question, not a request. "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said. Margaret studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that sees everything and says nothing. And then she was gone. The carriage rolled down the long dirt road, and the dust settled behind it, and the house exhaled. For the first 3 days, nothing unusual happened. Thomas was busy. He had creditors coming and going, men in suits who sat with him in the study with the door closed and left looking unsatisfied. Eliza could hear fragments, words like mortgage and harvest and note due, slipping under the door like smoke. She did not ask questions. She managed the house the way Margaret had instructed. She kept her head down and her movements quiet, and she was invisible. On the 4th night, Thomas called for her. It was past 10 o'clock. The household had gone quiet. Eliza was in the small room off the kitchen where she slept when she heard her name spoken by one of the younger men who worked the fields. He looked uncomfortable delivering the message, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Mr. Bowmont wants you in the study," he said. Eliza stood very still for a moment. She had been called to the study before, for household matters, for instructions, for the ordinary business of running a large estate. She told herself this was no different. She told herself that, and she almost believed it as she walked down the hall, her footsteps careful, her face already arranged into the expression she had practiced her whole life. Thomas was standing by the window when she entered. He had a glass of bourbon in one hand, and he was looking out at the dark. He did not turn around immediately when she came in, which was a thing she noted, a performance, a way of reminding her who had to wait and who did not. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. He turned then and looked at her with an expression she had seen on men before, an expression that had nothing generous in it, despite the softness he was trying to put on his face. "Sit down, Eliza." She did not want to sit. Sitting felt like surrendering a position. But she sat. He poured a second glass of bourbon and set it on the table near her. She did not touch it. "You've been running this house well," he said. He sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees like he was having a conversation between equals. "Margaret couldn't have left it in better hands." "Thank you, sir," Eliza said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, and here he paused in the deliberate way of a man who has rehearsed this and wants the silence to do work for him. "You're a smart woman, capable, more capable than most people in this county, free or otherwise." He smiled when he said it, like he was offering her a gift. "I think you know that." Eliza said nothing. The space between his words and hers felt like a field she had to cross without stepping on anything that would detonate. "Margaret is gone for some time," Thomas continued. "Weeks, maybe longer. And a house like this, a man in my position, there's a kind of loneliness that comes with responsibility." He looked directly at her now. "I think you understand what I'm saying." She understood perfectly. She had understood it from the moment the young man knocked on her door. She had understood it from the way Thomas had been watching her at meals for the past 6 months, from the way his eyes followed her when she moved through the rooms, from the small comments he had been making lately, compliments shaped like ordinary observations that she had been cataloging and filing away like evidence in a case she hoped would never go to trial. She looked at him, and she said carefully, "I'm not sure I do, sir." He was not put off by this. He had expected it. He leaned back and took a long drink of bourbon and let the silence stretch. "I'm not talking about anything improper," he said, and the word improper landed in the room like something that knew what it was. "Margaret and our arrangement has always been complicated. You've seen that. I'm talking about companionship, about having someone in this house who is present, who understands the weight of things." He paused again. "I'm talking about someone who could be, in this house, a kind of second wife." There it was. Not a wife, not free, not anything the law would ever recognize or protect. A second wife, a phrase invented to dress up a transaction in the language of something almost human. Eliza felt the cold move through her the way cold moves through old wood, slowly, deeply, into the grain of things. She thought about her mother. Her mother still lived on this plantation, in the small cabin nearest the east field. Her mother was 51 years old and had survived by the same art Eliza had inherited from her, the art of invisibility, of careful silence, of never giving anyone a reason to notice you too much. If Eliza refused this man, if she refused him badly, if she let anger or fear show on her face in a way he found inconvenient, her mother could be sold before the week was out. Thomas Bowmont was a man drowning in debt, and drowning men sell what they own. She thought about her younger brother, 16 years old, strong and proud in the way that terrified her, because pride in a young black man on a Mississippi plantation in 1851 was not a luxury. It was a target. He had already been noticed by the overseer, already singled out twice this season for corrections that left marks. One wrong word from Thomas Bowmont and her brother would be sold south to the sugar fields of Louisiana, where men went and did not come back. Eliza looked at Thomas Bowmont, and she made a calculation with her entire life. "I understand," she said quietly. He smiled, reached across and patted her hand like he had done her a favor. And Eliza Carter, 23 years old, daughter of a woman who had survived the unsurvivable, did what enslaved women across the American South had been doing for 200 years. She survived. But survival, she knew better than anyone, was never the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a debt that the powerful always intended to collect, and the powerless always had to find a way to repay without dying in the process. Outside, the Mississippi night pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the dark, a hound called out once and went quiet. The house that Thomas Bowmont owned, the house, the land, the people, all of it filed under his name in the county records, settled into its ordinary silence. But nothing in it was ordinary anymore. And deep in the pit of her stomach, in the place where fear and fury lived so close together they had learned each other's heartbeats, Eliza Carter made a second calculation. Margaret Bowmont would come home, and when she did, nothing in this house would be able to pretend it had not changed. The weeks that followed moved like the Mississippi in summer, slow on the surface, violent underneath. Eliza learned the new rules of the house the way she had learned every other rule in her life, by watching, by adjusting, by finding the narrow path between what was demanded and what could destroy her. Thomas Bowmont did not change overnight into a different kind of man. He was still the same man. He had simply stopped pretending to be something he was not, and in a strange and terrible way, that made him more dangerous than ever. Because a man who has removed his mask does not worry about putting it back on. He gave her things, small things at first. Better fabric for her dresses, a candle that burned longer, a cut of meat at supper that the others did not receive. Eliza understood immediately what these things were. They were not gifts. They were chains made to look like kindness. They were the beginning of a story Thomas was telling himself about what this arrangement was, and she knew that if she let him finish that story, she would disappear inside of it entirely. She did not thank him for the things. She received them with the same quiet neutrality she brought to everything. A nod, a lowered gaze, a silence that he interpreted as gratitude, because men like Thomas Bowmont always heard what they wanted to hear. But inside, Eliza was counting. Every night that passed was one night closer to Margaret's return. Every week that went by without a letter saying her sister had died was a week that kept the possibility of salvation alive. Eliza held on to that, the way you hold on to the edge of something when the ground has given out beneath you. Not comfortably, not without pain, but with everything you have. The rest of the household knew. She was certain of that. People who live in close quarters, who share walls and water and the same exhausted air, do not miss the shifts in a house's weather. Old Ruth, who had cooked in the Bowmont kitchen for 30 years and had seen things that had turned her hair white before she was 40, stopped meeting Eliza's eyes at breakfast. Not out of contempt, Eliza understood that. Out of grief. Out of the particular heartbreak of a woman who has seen this story before and knows exactly how it ends. One morning, Eliza was in the kitchen when Ruth set a bowl of grits down in front of her and let her hand rest briefly on Eliza's shoulder. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. That one touch carried everything: the acknowledgement, the sorrow, the solidarity that had no language, because language in that world was owned by the same people who owned everything else. Eliza pressed her lips together and stared at the bowl and did not cry. Young Samuel, 16 years old, her brother, he was the one she feared most for. He was old enough to sense that something had changed, young enough to still believe that anger was an answer. She caught him watching Thomas one evening from across the yard with an expression that stopped her cold, because she recognized it. She had felt it herself 1,000 times, but on her that expression lived behind a wall of carefully constructed stillness. On Samuel's face, it was right on the surface for anyone to read. She pulled him aside before supper. "Look at me," she said quietly. He looked at her, jaw tight, eyes burning. "Whatever you are thinking," she said, "you stop thinking it right now." "Eliza, no." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of iron. "You think I don't know what's on your face? You think he doesn't have eyes? Samuel, if he sells you south, I cannot get you back." "Mama cannot get you back. Nobody in this world can get you back from Louisiana. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. His hands were shaking. She reached out and covered them with hers. "I understand," he finally said, but his voice was hollow with the effort of swallowing something that should never have to be swallowed. She held his hands tighter. "Good," she said. "Now go eat." She watched him walk away, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she quickly sealed back shut, because she could not afford it. Not yet. Then came the night everything shifted. It was a Thursday, 6 weeks after Margaret had left, when Thomas came to her in a state she had not seen before. Not the slow, deliberate cruelty she had catalogued and prepared for, but something frantic underneath it, something unraveling. He had been in the study with 2 men she did not recognize, men who arrived in a black carriage with Georgia plates and left 2 hours later without speaking to anyone in the household. Whatever they had said to Thomas had taken something out of him. He moved through the house afterward like a man walking through water. He found her in the upstairs hallway. "I need you to listen to me," he said. His voice was lower than usual, less performance in it. She stopped and waited. "I am in a position," Thomas said, and he paused as though the next words cost him something, "where I may need to make decisions about this property, about the people on it." He looked at her directly. "You and your family, your mother, your brother, I want you to know that your situation is secure, as long as things remain as they are between us." Eliza felt the room tilt, not from surprise, from recognition, because this was the moment the arrangement revealed its true architecture. This was the moment she understood that what Thomas had called a second wife was in fact a hostage arrangement, dressed in the language of desire. Her compliance was the ransom for her family's safety. And now, he was reminding her of it openly, without the courtesy of pretending it was anything else. She looked at him and she said, "I understand, sir." He nodded, satisfied, and walked past her down the hall. She stood in the corridor for a long moment after he was gone. Her hands were completely still at her sides. Her face was arranged perfectly. Inside, something that had been slowly building in her for 6 weeks reached a temperature it had never reached before. Not panic, not despair. Clarity. She began to plan. Not escape. Escape was not possible, not with her mother and Samuel still on this property, not with the network of county patrols that turned the roads into traps. What she planned was something quieter and more precise. She began to track Thomas's habits with a new intentionality. What he drank, and how much, and when it made him careless. Who he trusted in the household, and why. Where he kept the correspondence that he didn't want anyone to read. She had noticed him locking the bottom drawer of the study desk with a small brass key he kept in his coat pocket. She began to construct, in the privacy of her own mind, a ledger. Every piece of information was a resource. Every secret was a form of currency. And in a world that had stripped her of every other form of power, information was the only thing she could accumulate without anyone being able to take it from her. 3 days later, a letter arrived from Savannah. One of the younger household girls brought it to Thomas in the study. Eliza was passing in the corridor when she heard him read it aloud to himself, a habit he had when he was alone and didn't know he was being heard. "I am recovering," he read. "I expect to be home within the fortnight." He stopped, said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, almost to himself, "God help us." Eliza stood in the corridor outside the closed door and absorbed those 3 words and everything they carried. Margaret was coming home. Not in weeks, in days. And Thomas Bowmont, who had spent 6 weeks building a secret architecture inside his own house, was suddenly looking at the structure he had built and realizing it had no foundation. She walked back to the kitchen slowly. She sat down at the table, where Ruth was already watching her over a pot of something simmering on the stove. "She's coming back," Eliza said. Ruth did not look surprised. She looked at Eliza for a long time, the steam from the pot rising between them like a curtain. "I know," Ruth said. "What do I do?" Ruth set down the spoon she was holding. She crossed the kitchen and sat across from Eliza and folded her hands on the table. And when she spoke, her voice had the particular texture of a woman who has survived things that would have killed someone with less nerve. "You don't do anything," Ruth said. "You stay exactly where you are. You let that woman walk into her own house and see with her own eyes what her husband has done. And then—" Ruth paused, and her eyes were very steady. "Then you watch very carefully what kind of woman she is." "What if she blames me?" Eliza asked. Ruth looked at her with something so raw it was almost unbearable to receive. "She might," Ruth said quietly. "That's the truth of it, child. She might." Eliza sat with that. The possibility of it, the particular injustice of being punished for a thing you did not choose by the person who should understand better than anyone what it means to have no choices at all. Outside the window, the road that led to the main gate was empty and dry and still. But somewhere down that road, on a carriage traveling north from Savannah, Margaret Bowmont was coming home. With her quiet eyes and her careful intelligence, and 16 years of knowing this house and this man and every secret these walls had ever tried to keep. Eliza looked out at that road and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 6 weeks. Not hope. Hope was too expensive a thing to spend carelessly. But something adjacent to it, something that said that the story was not finished, that the ledger was not closed, that the truth, which had been living in this house like something buried under the floorboards, was about to be forced into the light by the simple act of a woman walking through her own front door. And when that happened, Eliza Carter intended to be ready. Margaret Bowmont arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and she arrived without warning. No second letter, no revised date, no courtesy message sent ahead to give the house time to prepare. The carriage simply appeared at the end of the long road, moving fast, and by the time anyone in the household recognized it, it was already at the gate. Eliza was in the upstairs corridor when she heard the wheels on the gravel, and she felt every muscle in her body go rigid at exactly the same moment. She moved to the window without thinking and looked down, and there it was, the Bowmont carriage, dusty from the road, the driver already climbing down, and Margaret stepping out with the particular posture of a woman who has been traveling for 3 days and is not interested in being gracious about it. Thomas was in the study. He did not know yet. Eliza had exactly 90 seconds to make a decision about where to be and what her face would look like when Margaret walked through that door. She chose the hallway at the top of the stairs, visible, unavoidable. She stood there with her hands folded and her face arranged, and she waited. She heard the front door open. She heard Margaret's voice below, clipped and precise, asking where Mr. Bowmont was. She heard the young girl at the door stammer something about the study. She heard Margaret's footsteps cross the entrance hall without pausing, without the usual ritual of removing her hat and gloves and asking for tea. She walked directly toward the study, and the purposefulness of those footsteps told Eliza something important. Margaret had not come home early by accident. She had come home early on purpose. The study door opened. There was a silence that lasted long enough to have weight, and then Thomas's voice, surprised, off balance, the performance not yet assembled, said, "Margaret, I wasn't expecting—" "Clearly," Margaret said. Eliza stood at the top of the stairs and did not move. What followed was not a shouting match. That was the thing about Margaret Bowmont that Eliza had studied and catalogued and never fully understood until this moment. The woman did not shout. She did not throw things. She did not perform her anger for an audience. She moved through conflict the way a surgeon moves through a body, quietly, precisely, cutting exactly where it needed to be cut, and nowhere else. Eliza could hear the low murmur of their voices through the closed door, but could not make out the words, and the not knowing was somehow worse than anything she could have imagined. Old Ruth appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at Eliza with an expression that said everything without saying a single word. Eliza shook her head slightly. Not yet. The study door opened 20 minutes later. Thomas came out first. He looked like a man who had just been informed of a death, not grieving exactly, but hollowed, the way people look when a thing they knew was coming has finally arrived, and the knowing didn't make it easier. He did not look up at the stairs. He walked directly to the front door and out of it, into the yard, and Eliza heard the door close behind him with a quietness that was more unsettling than a slam would have been. Then Margaret appeared in the study doorway. She stood there for a moment. Then she looked up. She found Eliza at the top of the stairs immediately, as though she had known exactly where to look. Their eyes met across the full height of that staircase, and Eliza held the gaze because looking away felt like an admission of something she was not willing to admit. Margaret said, "Come down here, please." Her voice was absolutely level. That was the most frightening thing about it. Eliza came down the stairs. She followed Margaret into the study and stood just inside the door while Margaret sat behind the desk, Thomas's desk, with the ease of a woman reclaiming territory that was always hers. She folded her hands on the surface and looked at Eliza and said nothing for a long moment. The silence was a tool. Eliza recognized it because she used the same one. "How long?" Margaret finally said. Not a question with a rise at the end. A statement waiting to be completed. 6 weeks, ma'am, Eliza said. Margaret received this information without visible reaction. "Did you have a choice?" she said. And this time the flatness in her voice cracked open just slightly at the edges, just enough for something human to come through. Eliza looked at her directly. "No, ma'am," she said. "I did not." The room was very quiet. Margaret looked at her for a long time, and Eliza watched the woman process something complicated and painful, the particular reckoning of a woman who understands power and has lived inside its machinery long enough to know exactly how it grinds. She was not naive. She had been married to Thomas Bowmont for 16 years. Whatever she was feeling in this moment, it was not surprise. It was something older and heavier than surprise. "Your mother," Margaret said. "Your brother. He used them." It was not a question either. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when a thing they suspected has been confirmed, and the confirmation brings no relief at all. She stood up from behind the desk and walked to the window and stood with her back to Eliza for a long moment. When she turned around, something in her face had settled into a decision. "You will continue your duties in this house," Margaret said. "Exactly as before. Nothing changes in your position or your family's position. Do you understand me?" Eliza felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the specific tension of a woman waiting to find out whether she will be punished for what was done to her began to ease, just slightly, around the edges. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Good." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was not warm, but was honest, which, in Eliza's experience, was worth considerably more. "What happened in this house while I was gone is not your doing. I know the difference between a sin and a crime, Eliza, and I know which one my husband committed." Eliza stood very still and absorbed those words. In 16 years of living on this plantation, she had never once heard a white woman in a position of authority speak to her with that particular directness. Not kindness, not pity, but a raw accounting of truth. It was disorienting in the way that unexpected decency always is when you have learned to live without expecting it. She said, "Thank you, ma'am." Margaret turned back to the window and said quietly, almost to herself, "Don't thank me yet." That night, Thomas did not come back inside until well after dark. Eliza heard him moving through the house long after the household had gone quiet. Heard him stop outside the door of the room he had been calling hers for 6 weeks. Heard him stand there for a long moment. Then she heard him walk away. She lay still in the dark and stared at the ceiling and breathed. And the breathing felt different than it had in 6 weeks. Not free, nothing close to free, but less compressed. Like a fist that had been clenched so long it had forgotten it could open, had moved just one finger. But the story was not over. 3 weeks after Margaret's return, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She knew before she had words for knowing. The body announces these things in its own language, quiet and absolute, before the mind is ready to receive the information. She sat with it alone for 4 days, turning it over, examining it from every angle, the way you examine a wound to understand its depth before you decide how to treat it. On the 5th day, she told Ruth. Ruth did not speak for a long time. She set down whatever she was holding, and she sat down heavily in the chair by the kitchen wall, and she pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them. Then she looked up at Eliza with eyes that carried 30 years of this plantation and everything it had demanded from the people on it. "Does she know?" Ruth asked. "Not yet," Eliza said. "You have to tell her," Ruth said, "before he finds out, before anyone else finds out. You have to be the one to tell her, Eliza. Do you understand why?" Eliza understood. In a world where the story was always written by someone else, the only power you had was to get to the page first. She found Margaret the next morning in the east sitting room. She stood in the doorway and waited until Margaret looked up from the letter she was reading, and then she said it plainly, the way Ruth had taught her. Not with apology, not with drama, but with the simple weight of truth. "I am with child, ma'am." The letter in Margaret's hands did not move. Her eyes did not leave Eliza's face. The silence between them was enormous and inhabited. Then Margaret set the letter down with the deliberate care of a woman who is managing something very large, very carefully. She stood. She walked to the door and looked out into the hallway in both directions, and then closed it. When she turned back to Eliza, her face was composed, but her hands, Eliza noticed this, her hands were not entirely steady. "Does Thomas know?" Margaret asked. "No, ma'am." Margaret breathed in slowly through her nose. She walked back to her chair and sat down and steepled her fingers together and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. And Eliza stood in front of her and waited and did not fill the silence, because she had learned long ago that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is let another person think. "This child," Margaret finally said, "will not carry his name, will not carry his truth. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Eliza looked at her carefully.
"I think I do, ma'am." "There is a young man," Margaret said quietly. "Jacob. He works the stable. He is a decent man and he keeps his own counsel." She paused. "In the record that this household keeps, in the document that accounts for every person on this property and every child born to them, this child will be Jacob's." The room was absolutely still. "A lie," Eliza said. "Not an accusation, just a naming of the thing." Margaret met her eyes. "A lie," she said, "that will determine whether this child lives its life on this plantation as the master's secret, which means it lives at his mercy, his property, his to sell or keep or destroy as he chooses, or whether it lives as something slightly less endangered." She stopped. Her voice, when she continued, was lower, stripped of its composure just enough to reveal the bone underneath. "I cannot give this child freedom. I cannot give you freedom. What I can give is this: one lie, one record, one story that keeps him from having a claim." Eliza stood with the weight of it. A lie that could save a life, a truth that could sell it, and a woman offering her the only form of protection available in a world where no real protection existed. Outside the door, the house moved around them. The ordinary sounds of people going about the business of surviving another day on land that did not belong to them, in a country that did not yet count them as human. Eliza thought about the child growing inside her. She thought about what it meant to be born into this world, carrying the blood of a man who saw you as property. She thought about the ledger she had been building in her mind for months. Every piece of information, every secret, every resource. And she understood that this moment, right here, was the most important entry in it. She looked at Margaret Bowmont, a woman she did not love, could not trust entirely, would never mistake for an ally in any simple sense of the word, and she made her third calculation in as many months. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Margaret nodded, and in that nod was something neither of them had a name for. Not friendship, not equality, not any of the things that should have existed between two women in a world that had decided to set them against each other. But something real, something that would outlast both of them. Something that years later, a child would never know had been the only wall standing between his life and the man who could have claimed it. The lie took root, the same way all the most necessary lies do, quietly, without ceremony, buried in the ordinary paperwork of a plantation that recorded the births and deaths of its people, the same way it recorded the inventory of its livestock. Margaret wrote the entry herself. Jacob, stable hand. Father. She pressed the pen to the page with a steadiness that Eliza watched from across the room and did not fully understand until years later, because it takes a particular kind of cold courage to commit a mercy to paper in a world that would call it treason. Thomas found out about the pregnancy 3 days after the record was made. He found out the way men like Thomas always find things out, not because someone told him, but because he had been watching Eliza with the possessive attention of a man who believes he owns what he wants, and bodies tell their own stories to people paying that kind of attention. He came to find her on a Wednesday morning, moving through the house with a barely contained energy that Eliza recognized as the specific volatility of a man whose sense of ownership has been disturbed. He found her in the kitchen. Ruth was there. He looked at Ruth and said, "Leave us." Ruth looked at Eliza once, a look that carried a full conversation, and left the room. Thomas closed the door and turned to Eliza and said, "Is it true?" Not a question. Never a question with this man. Always a statement demanding confirmation. "Yes, sir," Eliza said.
Something moved across his face, complicated and fast, a collision of things she could not fully read, pride and calculation and something darker underneath both of them. "It's mine," he said. This was the moment the ledger she had been building for months, the lie Margaret had committed to paper, the third calculation she had made in that sitting room. This was the moment all of it was tested. She looked at him steadily and said, "No, sir." Thomas went very still. "The record has been made," Eliza continued, and she kept her voice completely flat, because flat was safer than any emotion in either direction. "Mrs. Bowmont made it herself. The child belongs to Jacob." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever stood inside. Thomas's jaw tightened. She watched him process what she had just told him, not just the content of it, but the architecture of it, that his wife had moved first, that the record existed, that to challenge it now, to claim the child publicly as his own, would be to confess to the county, to his creditors, to every man who sat with him at church on Sundays, exactly what he had been doing in his own house while Margaret was in Savannah. A man could lose everything for less. Not because the act itself would shock anyone who knew him. Men like Thomas were not unusual in what they did, but because the exposure of it in writing, in a record, with his wife as witness, was a kind of power no man in his position could afford to let stand publicly without it costing him. He knew it. She watched him know it. He took one step toward her, and she did not move. She stood exactly where she was and looked at him without flinching, and that stillness, that absolute refusal to give him the reaction he was reaching for, stopped him the way nothing else could have. He said very quietly, "You think she protects you." "I think the record is made, sir," Eliza said. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not rage, not desire, not the performance of authority. Something smaller and uglier. Something that looked, underneath everything else, remarkably like fear. He left the kitchen without another word. Eliza stood alone in the room and let herself shake for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stopped. What followed over the next 4 months was a cold war conducted entirely in silence and small gestures, fought inside the walls of a house that held its breath around them. Thomas withdrew. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no confrontation, no moment of declared hostility. He simply receded from Eliza's life, the way water recedes from a shore, pulling back from everything he had moved toward. And the household rearranged itself around his withdrawal, the way it had rearranged itself around everything else he had ever done. Margaret ran the house with a precision that had an edge to it now, sharp and deliberate. She made decisions without consulting Thomas. She handled the correspondence with the creditors herself. She had conversations with men who came to the estate about finances and contracts and harvest arrangements, and she conducted those conversations in the parlor with the door open, in plain sight, and Thomas sat in the study with the door closed and did not interfere. The balance of the house had shifted in a way that everyone felt and no one named, Ruth told Eliza one evening, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders and looking into the fire with the reflective calm of a woman who had outlasted everyone who had ever underestimated her. "That woman is not kind. Don't ever mistake her for kind. But she is smart enough to know that what he did made her weaker in this county, and she is not a woman who accepts weakness." "She protected me," Eliza said. "She protected her house," Ruth said. "You were inside it. That's different." She paused. "But different doesn't mean it doesn't matter." Eliza turned that over in her mind for a long time. The distinction Ruth was drawing was real and important. Margaret had not acted out of love or even sympathy in any simple sense. She had acted out of the cold strategic intelligence of a woman who understood that her husband's behavior had created a vulnerability and that the lie was a way of containing the damage. Eliza was a piece in a game she had not been invited to play. But the move Margaret had made had landed in her favor. And in a world where nothing landed in her favor by design, she had learned long ago to receive what came without requiring it to come dressed in the right intentions. The baby was born in February of 1852, during a night so cold the water in the bucket by the door had a skin of ice on it by morning. Ruth delivered him. He came into the world loud and insistent, with his fists already clenched, and when Ruth placed him in Eliza's arms and Eliza looked down at his face, she felt something so enormous and so violent move through her that she could not have named it even if the language had existed. She named him Daniel. She chose the name herself, without asking permission from anyone, and that small act of naming, that one assertion of ownership over the one thing in her life that no record could fully strip from her, felt like the first truly free thing she had done in as long as she could remember. Ruth looked at the baby and said quietly, "He has strong hands." "He'll need them," Eliza said. Margaret came to see the child 2 days later. She stood in the doorway of the small room where Eliza was nursing him and looked at him with an expression that Eliza could not categorize. Not maternal, not cold, something in between that held a complexity she did not try to reduce. Margaret looked for a long time. Then she said, "He is healthy." "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said. Margaret looked at her then, directly, and said something she had never said before, and never said again. "I'm sorry for what was done to you in this house." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Eliza did not know what to do with them. An apology from a woman who had not committed the crime, but had lived inside the system that made it possible. An apology that cost something real to say and could not undo a single thing that had happened. She held it the way you hold something fragile that you are not sure how to put down without breaking it. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. Margaret nodded and left. Then came the twist that none of them had calculated for. Thomas Bowmont's debts caught up with him in April of that year, and when they did, they came all at once, the way financial collapses always do, not as a slow erosion, but as a sudden dissolution. The men in suits from Georgia returned. There were others with them this time. There were documents spread across the study table that Eliza could see through the crack in the door when she passed. Figures and signatures and the particular language of men dividing what remains after everything of value has been extracted. She heard Thomas's voice through the door one afternoon, higher than usual, arguing with someone she did not recognize. "The people on this property are assets. They will be sold as part of the settlement." And then Margaret's voice, cutting across his with the precision of a blade. "No." Silence. "The household staff," Margaret said, "are under my management and have been for 16 years. Any arrangement made regarding this property will reflect that. I have correspondence with every creditor your husband owes, and I have made certain arrangements of my own." A pause. "Gentlemen, I suggest you review the documents you received from my solicitor in Natchez before you make any further claims about what belongs to whom in this house." Eliza stood in the corridor and could not breathe. She did not know about the solicitor. She did not know about any arrangement. She had known that Margaret was handling the creditors, but she had not known, had not allowed herself to imagine, that Margaret had been building something in parallel to the collapse, the same way Eliza herself had been building her ledger of information. Two women in the same impossible house, both constructing, in secret, the only walls they had. The men from Georgia left that afternoon. Thomas did not come out of the study until after dark. 2 weeks later, a document was placed in Eliza's hands by Margaret's personal attendant, a folded paper with Margaret's seal on it, handed over without explanation, without ceremony. Eliza opened it and read it, and had to read it a second time because the first time she read it, she was certain she had understood it wrong. It was a paper of manumission for Eliza, for her mother, for Samuel. Not freedom in any full sense, Nothing in 1852 Mississippi was freedom in any full sense for a black woman with a baby and no money and no land. But freedom from the Bowmont claim, freedom from Thomas Bowmont's name on their lives, freedom to exist in the narrow and dangerous margin that the law permitted and that other people would spend the next 13 years fighting to expand. Eliza stood holding the paper and felt something she had no word for. Not joy. Joy was too simple, and this was not a simple moment. Not gratitude. Gratitude implied a debt she did not owe to a woman who had done a complicated thing for complicated reasons. Something else. Something that felt like the ground shifting very slightly under her feet in a direction that was not down. She found Ruth in the kitchen. She held out the paper without speaking. Ruth read it, looked up. Her eyes were wet, which Eliza had never seen before, and would never see again.
"What do I do with this?"
Eliza asked. Ruth folded the paper carefully and pressed it back into her hands and held both of Eliza's hands in her own for a moment. "You hold on to it," she said, "and you walk out of here with your head up, and you don't look back." Eliza Carter left the Bowmont plantation on a Thursday morning in May of 1852, with her mother on one side, her brother Samuel on the other, and Daniel in her arms, 10 weeks old, fists still clenched, already looking at the world with the particular intensity of a person who has arrived with something to prove. Thomas Bowmont watched from the window of the study as they walked down the road. He did not come outside. He did not speak. He simply watched, and whatever he felt in that moment, he kept it where he had kept everything else, locked in a drawer, behind a door, inside a house where the walls had learned to hold secrets so well that even the truth could not always find its way out. Margaret stood at the front door. She watched them go. She did not wave. But when Eliza reached the gate and turned, one last time, one single backward look, their eyes met across the full length of that road, and something passed between them that had no name in any record, in any document, in any official accounting of what happened on the Bowmont plantation in the summer of 1851. Eliza turned back to the road ahead and kept walking. She had survived the unsurvivable. She had protected the people she loved with the only weapons available to her: silence, patience, precision, and the hard, cold mathematics of a woman who had been forced to count the cost of everything and waste nothing. She had walked into the worst kind of trap this world sets for women who have no power, and she had walked out the other side, carrying a child, a paper, and a truth that history would never fully write down. But she had lived it. And the living of it, the enduring of it, the refusing to be erased by it, was its own kind of record. One that no plantation ledger, no county document, no man with a pen and a claim of ownership could ever fully account for or take away. Daniel Carter grew up never knowing the full weight of the story he was born inside. But he grew up free. And in 1852 Mississippi, free was the most radical thing a person could be. His mother had made sure of it. And that was enough. That was everything.